Let's all face it, building a FPV drone is a really hard and expensive affair. We spend so much money, time, and efforts to get that perfect drone, and it will be a shame if it doesn't last us very long. So, that is why in this video, let me show you how I maintain my FPV drones so they continue to serve me for a longer time and have a good lifespan. Let's get started. Alright, before I show you how I maintain my FPV drone, I want to thank you for tuning into this video. If you're new onto this channel, then hi, my name is Ayan, and over here I talk about tech, travel, and transform. So if you resonate with any of this thing, do hit that subscribe button. Now that's out of the picture, let's talk about how I maintain my FPV drones. So I have been doing FPV for a little over 10 years. I have built multiple drones. I have done multiple FPV flights in different locations. Currently, I'm operating a fleet of 7+ FPV drones. So I do know a thing or two about maintaining FPV drones so they have a maximum lifespan and they can continue to serve you well. I'm gonna share a very crucial advice with everyone about maintaining FPV drones. Especially a lot of beginner FPV pilots make that mistake and this end up costing a lot of money. A lot of headache to them because if you're spending a lot of money on FPV, it's not a good experience that you cannot make the most out of your drone. So stay till the very end, and that's when I'm gonna share that particular specific tip. But before that, let's talk about the pre-flight checks because you do not want any human error causing the drone to crash, and that will be a shame because you spend so much money onto your drone, and if you just do some small mistakes, your drone can crash and the frame can be broken, the motor can be burned. So it's very important before you fly a drone, you do certain pre-flight check. So let's start with the pre-flight check, and the very first point over here is checking your propellers. So before you fly your drone, make sure that the propellers are rightly set in order. The propellers in the software, for example, if you're running a beta flight, can be inward rotating or outward rotating. Depending on that, you need to make sure that your motor is clockwise and the right propeller is on that motor, especially if you're doing the first flight, and if the propellers and motor combinations are not right, the drone highly will not take off and will crash, and the damage can be severe depending on the crash. So make sure you do check your propellers. Another thing when it comes to propeller is to check that your propellers do not have any crack, they are not broken, especially if you have already flown your drone multiple times, and if it's crashed, often sometimes we neglect that, and if there is a crack on the propeller, if there is any sort of bend, that could cause the motor to heat up, especially for the bent propellers, and it could cause motor damage. Also, if the propeller is broken, there are high chances that during mid-flight the drone will crash and eventually you will end up breaking your frame or whatever, or even your GoPro expensive cameras. Another thing is to make sure that your propellers are rightly tight, so your propeller shouldn't be loose when connected to the motor. So all these things are really critical that will make sure that your drone flies well. So never ignore it when doing a pre-flight check, and always look for the propellers and make sure everything looks good. Alright, moving to the next thing that you need to check during the pre-flight are your antennas. And on the FPV drones, there are two types of antennas. One is for the video transmitter and one is for the remote controller. So make sure that whenever you are flying your drone, before you take off, the antenna should look good, the antenna should be upright and in the right direction. There is no breaking of wire that goes into the receiver. The antennas are not bent, they are not cracked, and this will make sure that you will have a solid RC signal, you will have a solid video feed. Because if you're flying a FPV, especially if you're doing a little bit long range, and if your video antenna is broken, then you will lose the video mid-flight and you have to eventually crash, and that is not a good experience. So always make sure that all your antennas on the drones are in good condition before you take off. Another thing that you must check during your pre-flight checkup is your camera mount, and this is the mistake that a lot of beginner pilots make. If you are flying your drone for the first time, don't worry about putting a GoPro, don't worry about putting a DJI action camera. Just fly your drones without a camera for 1 or 2 flights, make sure everything is good, because if the drone is not behaving as expectedly, then your drone will crash along with the expensive camera, and you might lose your GoPro, you might lose your DJI action cameras or Insta360 Go forever. So this is highly not recommended that you put the camera, especially in the maiden flight. But also, if you have already flown your drone multiple times and now you want to put the camera, make sure the camera mount is stable, it is not wobbly, because if you have a wobbly camera mount, it will introduce a lot of vibrations, a lot of shakes in the drone frame, and it will be a very unpleasant and a very unstable flight, and you will blame PIDs, ease, you will blame your rates, but the actual reason is the wobbly camera mount. So make sure whenever you are mounting a camera to your drone, the camera mount is stable, it is solid, and it is not wobbling around. Talking about the last point in the pre-flight checkup is to check your battery connector. So usually the battery connector that we use on the FPV drones is XT60, and whenever we connect the battery connector, there are often chances that these battery connectors get loose and they can run into propellers, which can cause serious damage. It can cause short circuit, it can cause your drone to catch fires mid-flight, and it can be a lot of problems. It could also be your drone is totally disconnected from the power supply and it will fell like a rock on people where you are flying, and it is not a good sight. Trust me, I have seen that. So make sure that the battery connector, the XT60 connector of your drone is very well secured, it's tight, and it's not obstructing the propellers. So these are the important points that you need to make sure whenever you are doing a pre-flight check. And I highly recommend that no matter how much experience you have with the FPV drones, always do a pre-flight check. Now let's move to the post-flight check, and these are the steps that we need to take care of to maintain our drone after we have a flight, after we have successfully landed. You can do it on the field, you can do some of it at the home whenever you go back home and take your drone with you. So now let's talk about the post-flight checkups. Alright, the very first thing that you need to check on your drone after you take a flight, especially if your drone is crashed during a flight, is to check and make sure that there are no cracks on the frame. Oftentimes after you crash, your drone can get some cracks on the frame, and depending on the severity of these cracks, depending on where they are, it could highly change the physics and the dynamics of your drone. It will not fly great, and it can also break mid-flight. So do inspect your drone frame thoroughly, and do see that there are no cracks on the drone frame. If there are cracks, you might need to consider replacing the drone frame altogether. If it's a minor crack, it could be filled with some CA glues. So do make sure that you check and have knowledge of all the cracks on your drone frame, especially if you had a recent crash. Alright, moving to the next post-flight checkup, and this is something that I recommend to someone who has just flown the drone for the first time, especially during the maiden flight, especially during the first 10 flights of your drone, is as soon as your drone is landed, check and see if your motors are heated. The motors of the drone should be not very much heated. It should be warm, but it shouldn't be too hot to touch. If that is the case, then there are certain things that you could change. Either your PIDs are too aggressive, either your propeller is wrong or cracked, or either your motor is shorting somewhere. So make sure whenever, especially if you are just making a new drone and you want to test it, whenever you land it, check the motors and make sure they are warm, but they are not too hot to touch. Similar to motor, do also check your battery and make sure it's not too hot, especially if you're running a lower cell count battery like 3S or 4S. They shouldn't be very hot to touch. They should be warm, but not too hot to touch. If your battery is too hot to touch, then you need to figure out what's wrong with your drone. It can degrade the battery life significantly, and the battery can also catch fire. So always after landing, do check the temperature of the motors and of the battery using your hands. Alright, moving to the next point that you need to take care of post-flight is your battery voltage. So oftentimes we FPV drone pilots keep monitoring our battery levels on the on-screen display on our FPV goggles, and when a battery is going beyond a certain threshold in voltage, we land the drone because we don't want to damage our battery. It is not recommended if you're flying a LiPo battery to go beyond 3.4 volts per cell, but oftentimes some cell can spike down into the voltage and there could be some imbalance between the cell. So what you need to do after you land the drone, after a few seconds, measure the voltage of every cell of your battery using a voltage checker or a portable charger, and you need to make sure that all the cells are close together. It shouldn't be that one cell is at 4.1 volt and the other cell is at 3.6 volt. That is really causing the battery damage, and your battery can be damaged permanently. If that is the case, when you reach home, you can charge the battery slowly, especially that cell, but make sure that you monitor your battery cell voltage in the field, and if there is any anomaly, you need to address that right away. Another recommendation that I wanted to give you related to the same thing is don't charge the battery immediately. So what people do, especially this happens in the FPV drone racing, is after you complete a flight, you charge your battery immediately after you land. It is not recommended, especially for the batteries which are not higher capacity, especially for the batteries which are not made for FPV drones. They are not very highly cyclable in terms of charge and discharge cycle. So when you land, give your battery some time to breathe, at least 10 to 15 minutes after you put that on charger. Before that, you can use it because now we have a good battery technology with nanotech, lithium high voltage, lithium iron, with all sort of technology. you can charge it, but it will slowly degrade your battery life. So make sure you do not charge the battery immediately. You take some time, give the battery time to breathe before putting that on charger. Similar to pre-flight checkup, after you land, make sure the propellers are tight. If the propellers are loosening, you can use the prop wrench to tighten the propellers and make sure they stay tight coupled with the motor. Now there are few things that you could do in the longer run to make sure that your drone has a good lifespan. This is something that you don't have to do on daily basis, but this is something that you do after every, let's say, 15 to 20 flights or after every few months to make sure that your drone is doing good, and you can easily do it yourself. So starting from the first point is to lubricate your motor bearings. So every brushless DC motor have bearings, and these bearings are mechanical contacted with the motor, and because this is the rotating part, it often requires extra lubrication. So you can put a small drop of machine oil with a dropper and then just rotate the rotator on top of the stator of the motor, and your motor bell will be lubricated, your motor bearing will be lubricated and have a longer lifespan. Similarly, when you open the motor to lubricate the bearing, oftentimes you can find some debris in the motor that is stuck from the grass where you are flying, and you can use a small gentle plastic brush to wipe it off. Never ever use a metal brush to wipe off your motor stator because it can permanently damage your motors. Every few months, open the top plate of the drone and clean it up with a wiping cloth. You can also use some sort of food distilled water, of course, when the battery is disconnected. Now, while building drone, I highly recommend that you use Loctites on your screws, because if you haven't used a Loctites, these screw, because of the vibration on the drone frame, can come it loose. So every few weeks, check all the screws on your drone and make sure they are tightened. It's recommended to put on some Loctite, especially for the screws that you don't want to open often. But if you don't want to put a Loctite, just make sure that you're tightening it from time to time. Now, while you are maintaining your drone, check for the scratches, check for any cracks, check if any antenna is damaged, and this is the habit that you need to follow in order to maintain your drone. Now, last but not the least, in the post-flight checkup is to check your battery connector. So the XT60 connector that we use on FPV drones often becomes loose from regular contact, and it can pretty much easily comes out on its own. So what I do, I use a small toothpick and I use the female part of the XT60 connector and opens up the connector a bit. This tightens the connection between the male and the female plug, and it ensures that your drone and the battery stays connected. Alright, now allow me to share the most critical and the most important advice that I wanted to share with every one of you, especially the beginner pilot. And that advice is that if it works, don't touch it. And trust me, I have been guilty of doing opposite for very long years, and that is one of the reasons that I didn't progress good as a drone pilot as I should be. This is the reason that I spent a lot of money on my drones and I still couldn't get the best experience, because oftentimes I was chasing the best motors, the best receiver, the best frames, and even the latest updated firmware on my receiver, the latest updated Betaflight firmware on my flight controller, and I was focusing more on building the best drone versus becoming the best drone pilot. And this is something that I really made peace with a few years back, and I changed this habit. And the habit is, if it works for me, I'm not gonna change it. If a drone setup works for me on the Betaflight older version that is older than 1 year old, then I'm not gonna change it, I'm not gonna update it, even though it has latest feature. If the features are not something that I require, if the bug fixes are not something that solves my problem, I'm not gonna update the new Betaflight firmware. I'm not gonna update my receiver with the new Express LRI system. I'm not gonna change the frame. I'm not gonna buy the most advanced recent motors and I put it on the drone, replacing the old motors, unless my drone really needs to. And this is a very good example. This drone is with me for the past 2.5 years, and trust me, I haven't made a single change into this drone. It is the same motors that I built this originally with, same camera, same flight controller, and this is a budget drone in my opinion, because I'm using Emax Eco motors, I'm using Cadex Vista, I'm using SpeedDB flight controller. Everything here you see is a very budget friendly drone parts. These are not the most expensive, and I haven't updated the Betaflight firmware for almost 2 years. So you might be thinking that I'm mad, there are a lot of new features, but I don't really care. I want to fly drones, I don't want to build drones. If there are bug fixes that I care about, if there are features that I really want in this drone, only then I will update it. I will only change the motors when these motors give up on me completely. But for now, for the last 2.5 years, this drone is working great. I have used this drone for client work, I have used this drone in my client videos, and this drone never disappointed me. So this is the last piece of advice that I wanted to leave you with all. If it works for you, don't consider changing it. Focus on being a good pilot than being a good builder. Alright, now that being said, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something new. This is how I maintain my FPV drones that I wanted to share with you. If you enjoyed this video, do leave a like below and share it with your FPV friends, and I'm gonna see you in the next one.